America built the most powerful industrial war machine in human history. Everyone knows that. The factories, the shipyards, the steel mills, the assembly lines that never stopped running, day and night, 7 days a week, producing weapons and equipment at a scale the world had never seen before. America outproduced every other nation on Earth during World War II. America fed, armed, and equipped not just its own forces but the forces of its allies as well. American industrial power was one of the decisive factors in winning the war. So here is a question that should make you deeply uncomfortable. If America was so good at building everything, if American industry was so dominant, if American engineers and designers were so talented, then why was America's best tank in World War II not American at all? Why was the most capable, most feared, most effective tank that American forces deployed in the critical battles of the war a British design, powered by a British engine, built to British specifications? Why did American tank crews, given the choice, sometimes prefer a foreign tank over the product of their own nation's industry? Today we are going to answer that question completely and honestly. Today we are going to tell the story of the tank that America needed but could not build itself. This is the story of America's best tank in World War II. And it was not American. Let us start where any honest story about American tanks in World War II has to start. Let us start with the Sherman. The M4 Sherman is America's most famous tank of the war. It was produced in enormous numbers, over 49,000 units across all variants. It was reliable, it was relatively easy to maintain, and it was available in quantities that gave Allied commanders real strategic options. These are genuine achievements, and they should not be minimized. But the Sherman had problems. Serious problems. Problems that got American tankers killed in large numbers, and that American military leadership was very slow to acknowledge, and even slower to fix. The Sherman's main gun, the 75mm weapon fitted to the most common variants, was inadequate against the frontal armor of German heavy tanks at combat ranges. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa in February 1943, American forces got their first real taste of what German armor could do. At Normandy in 1944, American tank crews discovered to their horror that their 75mm shells were bouncing off Panther tanks at ranges where they should have been able to fight effectively. The Panther was not a heavy tank. It was Germany's medium tank, the workhorse of the German armored force. And American Shermans could not reliably defeat it from the front. Against the Tiger, the situation was even worse. American tank crews developed tactics of overwhelming German tanks with numbers, accepting terrible losses to get close enough or to flank German armor where the armor was thinner. These tactics worked, in the sense that Germany lost the war. But they were costly in blood, and they represented a fundamental mismatch between the weapon American tankers had and the weapon they needed. The armor protection of the Sherman was also a serious problem. The tank had a tendency to catch fire when penetrated, earning it the grim nickname Ronson among Allied troops, after the cigarette lighter with the advertising slogan that lights first time, every time. American tankers called it the Tommy Cooker. British tankers called it the Ronson. The nickname was dark humor that masked a terrible reality. When a Sherman was hit by a German anti-tank round, the chances of it catching fire were uncomfortably high. The reasons were partly to do with the ammunition stowage and partly to do with the fuel system. Improvements were made as the war progressed, with wet stowage ammunition racks that significantly reduced fire risk, but these improvements took time, and in the meantime crews died in burning tanks. American military leadership knew about these problems. Reports from the front were clear and consistent. Tank crews, their commanders, their brigade and division commanders, all reported the same things. The gun was not powerful enough. The armor was not thick enough. The tank was catching fire too easily. But the American military procurement system, dominated by General Leslie McNair and his doctrine that tanks should not fight other tanks, that was the job of tank destroyers, was very slow to respond. McNair believed that tanks should be used to exploit breakthroughs, not to slug it out with enemy armor. Tank versus tank combat was supposed to be handled by dedicated tank destroyers armed with powerful guns. This doctrine made a certain theoretical sense, but it collided with the reality of the battlefield, where tanks inevitably found themselves fighting other tanks regardless of what doctrines said they should be doing. The result was that American tank crews went into battle in a vehicle that was outgunned and underprotected, while the American military debated doctrine rather than fixing the problem. So what did Britain do differently? And why does this matter to our story? Britain had its own Sherman problems. British forces in North Africa and Italy were also using Shermans and finding the same limitations. But Britain had a solution, and that solution came from an unlikely combination of a British tank chassis and a British artillery gun. The solution was the Sherman Firefly. The Sherman Firefly was born from desperation and British engineering ingenuity. The Royal Armoured Corps needed a tank that could fight German armor on equal terms. The Panther and the Tiger were appearing in increasing numbers, and the standard Sherman was not the answer. British engineers, led by a man named George Wythe, who had fought in North Africa and understood the problem firsthand, proposed fitting the 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a modified Sherman hull. The 17-pounder was Britain's most powerful anti-tank gun at the time. It had already proven devastating against German armor when used in the towed anti-tank role. If it could be fitted into a Sherman, the result would be a tank that combined American reliability and availability with a gun that could actually defeat German heavy armor. The engineering challenge was considerable. The 17-pounder was a large gun with a powerful recoil that the Sherman turret was never designed to accommodate. The gun had to be modified, the turret had to be modified, the ammunition stowage had to be completely rethought, and the radio had to be moved from the turret to the hull to make room. The work was done with impressive speed and ingenuity. By early 1944, the Sherman Firefly was ready for production. It entered service just in time for the Normandy invasion in June 1944. The impact of the Firefly on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Here was a tank that looked like a Sherman, that used the same reliable mechanical systems as a Sherman, but that carried a gun capable of defeating a Tiger at ranges of over 1,000 meters. German tank commanders, who had grown accustomed to regarding Sherman tanks as targets rather than threats, suddenly found themselves facing a weapon that could kill them at long range. The Firefly became the most feared Allied tank on the Western Front almost immediately after Normandy. German tank crew training began specifically addressing the Firefly threat. German commanders ordered their crews to identify and prioritize the Firefly in any Allied armored formation. The distinctive longer gun barrel of the Firefly made it recognizable, and the Germans knew that if they were going to engage Allied armor, they needed to knock out the Fireflies first. Michael Whitman, the most celebrated Tiger commander of the war, was almost certainly killed by a Sherman Firefly. The evidence for exactly what killed Whitman at Saint-Inbertin in August 1944 has been debated by historians, but the most credible analysis points to a Firefly round penetrating his Tiger. The man who had built his reputation on the invincibility of his Tiger, who had destroyed over 130 tanks during his career, was killed by a Sherman. A modified Sherman. A British modified Sherman carrying a British gun. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about the Firefly's impact. Now let us talk about what happened on the American side when the Firefly proved its worth. You would think that the American military would have immediately moved to adopt the Firefly or develop an equivalent. You would think that after Normandy, after the battles in the Bocage, after seeing what the Firefly could do, American procurement would have urgently equipped American tank units with a gun capable of defeating German armor. You would be wrong. The American military's response to the Firefly was complicated by institutional pride, by doctrinal stubbornness, and by the same procurement inertia that had produced the Sherman problem in the first place. There were American efforts to upgun the Sherman. The M4A 176mm Sherman was developed and deployed, and it was a significant improvement over the 75mm version. The 76mm gun could penetrate Panther armor under certain conditions, though it still struggled against the Tiger frontally. But the 76mm Sherman was not as capable as the Firefly. The 17-pounder was a more powerful gun, full stop. And despite the evidence from Normandy and beyond, the American military was not rushing to adopt the British solution. Partly this was institutional resistance to admitting that a British modified version of an American tank was better than the American original. Partly it was the continuing influence of McNair's doctrine. Partly it was the genuine complexity of changing production lines mid-war. But the result was that American tank crews continued to go into battle in vehicles that were outgunned by the German armor they were fighting, while the solution was quite literally sitting in British armored regiments alongside them. Let us also consider the Comet tank, because the Comet represents what Britain was capable of producing when it focused its engineering talent on solving the tank problem properly. The Comet was a British cruiser tank that entered service in late 1944 and was used in the final campaign in Northwest Europe in 1945. It carried a version of the 17-pounder gun, though modified to fit the turret, and it was fast, well-armored, and mechanically much more reliable than earlier British cruiser tanks. The Comet was arguably the best all-around Allied tank of the war. It was not produced in the numbers of the Sherman, and it arrived late, but it represented the direction that British tank design was heading and the capabilities that British engineers could deliver when given the resources and the time. The story behind why Britain developed the Firefly and the Comet while America stuck with the upgunned Sherman is really a story about institutional culture and battlefield learning. Britain had been at war since 1939. British forces had fought in France, in North Africa, in Italy, and the lessons of those campaigns had been painfully absorbed. British tank crews had experienced firsthand the consequences of being outgunned by German armor. The institutional pressure to solve the gun problem was urgent and genuine because the people making procurement decisions had seen what happened when British tanks could not kill German tanks. The emotional and professional weight of that experience drove innovation. America entered the land war in North Africa in late 1942, more than 3 years into the war for Britain. American forces were less experienced, American doctrine was less tested by actual combat, and American procurement was operating from assumptions that had not yet been fully tested by the reality of fighting German armor at close range. The early American experience in North Africa at Kasserine was a brutal education, but the institutional response was slower than it should have been. McNair's doctrine had influential supporters, and the Sherman had powerful industrial backing from the manufacturers who were building it in such profitable quantities. Changing course required overcoming institutional inertia that was harder to shift than it should have been. Let us talk about the crews themselves, because they are at the heart of this story. American tankers were brave, professional, and resourceful. They made the best of the equipment they had. When they could get Fireflies, they valued them enormously. The Firefly gave them something they desperately needed, which was the ability to threaten German heavy armor rather than just hoping to overwhelm it with numbers. American liaison officers with British units repeatedly reported on the Firefly's effectiveness. The information reached American commanders, but the institutional response remained inadequate throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond. There is a story that captures the essence of this entire issue perfectly. During the fighting in Normandy in the summer of 1944, it was common practice in British armored squadrons to have one Firefly in each troop of 4 tanks. The other 3 tanks were standard Shermans. The tactical doctrine was clear. The Fireflies would engage German heavy armor at long range while the standard Shermans maneuvered to support and exploit. German tank commanders knew this and deliberately targeted the Fireflies first, knowing that if they could knock out the Firefly, the remaining 3 Shermans were much less dangerous. American tankers operating near British units saw this dynamic and understood it immediately. The Firefly was the only tank in that formation that the Germans truly feared, and it was British. Now let us broaden the story and look at the wider context of tank development during the war, because this helps explain why the best tank available to American forces ended up being a British modification. The fundamental challenge facing all tank designers in World War II was the constant back and forth between armor and firepower on one side and gunpowder on the other. As tanks got better armor, guns were developed to defeat that armor. As guns got more powerful, armor got thicker. This meant that tank design was a constant moving target. A tank that was adequate in 1942 might be obsolete by 1944. Nations that were willing to continuously update their designs and their guns stayed competitive. Nations that locked into a particular design or a particular doctrine fell behind. Germany understood this dynamic instinctively. The progression from the Panzer III to the Panzer IV to the Panther to the Tiger represented a continuous escalation of capability driven by battlefield experience. Each new German tank was a response to specific threats and specific lessons. The Panther, in particular, was a direct response to the T-34. When Germany encountered the T-34 in 1941 and found it superior to existing German armor, German designers produced the Panther, which matched the T-34's sloped armor and exceeded its firepower. This was rapid, threat-driven development. It was expensive and it had its own problems, but it demonstrated a willingness to continuously improve that American procurement failed to match. The Soviet Union's approach was different again. The T-34 was continuously improved throughout the war. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, was dramatically more capable than the original T-34-76. The 85mm gun gave the T-34-85 the ability to defeat German heavy armor at reasonable combat ranges. Soviet production was organized around continuous improvement of a proven design rather than developing entirely new vehicles, and this approach produced a competitive, capable, affordable tank in the enormous quantities that the Soviet war effort demanded. America's approach was to produce an enormous number of Shermans and rely on quantity and logistics to overwhelm German quality. This approach ultimately worked in the sense that Germany was defeated, but it imposed a heavy cost in American lives. The men who died in burning Shermans because the gun could not stop a Panther and the armor could not stop a German anti-tank round. Those men paid the price of American procurement failures with their lives. That is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of this story. The British solution, the Firefly, was not perfect. It had its own limitations. The modified turret meant there was no room for a co-driver's hull gun, which reduced the tank's ability to engage infantry at close range. The gun was so powerful that it produced enormous stress on the turret ring, creating maintenance issues with prolonged use. The longer barrel made the Firefly slightly more difficult to maneuver in close country. British armored units had to develop specific tactics to use the Firefly effectively while minimizing its exposure to German return fire. These were real issues and they should be acknowledged honestly. But against these limitations must be set the fundamental fact that the Firefly could do something that no standard Sherman could do. It could kill a Tiger from the front at over 1,000 meters. It could kill a Panther at combat ranges. It gave Allied armored formations a weapon that German tank commanders genuinely feared. In the brutal arithmetic of tank warfare, the ability to kill the enemy before the enemy kills you is the most important capability a tank can have. The Firefly had that capability. The standard American Sherman did not. That difference matters. It matters enormously. It mattered to the men who fought in those tanks, and it matters to any honest assessment of which was America's best available tank in the war. The story of the Firefly is also a story about Anglo-American cooperation and the complexities of coalition warfare. Britain and America were fighting the same war toward the same goals, but they were not always fighting it in the same way or with the same equipment. The differences in national doctrine, national procurement culture, and national institutional priorities meant that the two allies sometimes made very different choices about weapons and tactics. The Firefly was a British choice that the Americans were slow to adopt. The P-51 Mustang was an American aircraft that the British had actually helped to develop, but that America took credit for. Coalition warfare is complicated and credit is not always distributed fairly. Let us also address the political dimension. After the war, the narrative of American industrial supremacy and American military effectiveness became deeply embedded in both popular culture and official history. America had won the war. America's weapons had been decisive. America's tanks, planes, and ships had overwhelmed the enemy with the sheer power of American industry. This narrative was not entirely wrong. American industrial power was genuinely decisive, but it obscured inconvenient truths. The truth that American tanks were outgunned by German armor throughout much of the war. The truth that the best tank available to Allied forces in Northwest Europe in 1944 was a British modification of an American vehicle. The truth that the solution to America's tank problem came from British engineers, not American ones. These truths were inconvenient, and they were largely buried under the triumphalist post-war narrative. There is a broader lesson in this story about the relationship between industrial power and military effectiveness. America in World War II demonstrated that industrial capacity, production volume, logistics, and supply chain management could compensate for gaps in weapons quality. That is a genuine military lesson, and it should not be dismissed. But it is not the whole lesson. The men who fought in tanks that were outgunned by their opponents paid a real price for those quality gaps. The fact that America ultimately won does not mean that American procurement decisions were correct. It means that America could afford the cost of those decisions in blood and treasure. Not every nation could afford that cost. And not every war would provide the strategic circumstances that allowed industrial quantity to overcome weapons quality. The Firefly remained in British service after the war, a testament to its genuine capability. It was used by a number of nations in the post-war period and continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of the 17-pounder gun against armor that post-war conflicts occasionally required it to face. The Firefly's post-war service record confirmed what Normandy had demonstrated. It was an extraordinarily capable fighting vehicle. The British engineers who created it, the tank crews who fought in it, and the military leadership that pushed for its development despite institutional resistance, all deserve recognition that history has not fully given them. The Sherman also remained in service after the war, in enormous numbers, because so many had been built that they were available cheaply to nations that could not afford more modern vehicles. The Sherman served in Korea, in the Middle East, and in numerous other post-war conflicts. In the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, both sides used Shermans. In later Israeli service, the Sherman was dramatically upgraded with a French 105mm gun, creating the Super Sherman, or M50, which was a formidable combat vehicle into the 1960s. The irony of the Sherman's post-war story is that it was repeatedly improved by other nations in exactly the ways that American procurement had been too slow to implement during the war itself. The question this story ultimately forces us to confront is this: what does it mean to have the best tank? Does it mean the most produced? Does it mean the most reliable? Does it mean the fastest to repair? Does it mean the most logistically supportable? Or does it mean the one that most effectively fulfilled the primary purpose of a tank in combat, which is to destroy enemy armor while surviving enemy fire? By that last measure, the most important measure, the measure that mattered most to the men who climbed into these machines and drove them toward German guns, the best tank available to American forces in the critical campaigns of 1944 was the Sherman Firefly. It was British, and America needed it more than American military leadership ever wanted to admit. The legacy of this story is still with us today. Modern American military procurement still struggles with the tension between producing large numbers of good enough equipment and smaller numbers of superior equipment. The debate between quantity and quality in military procurement is as old as warfare itself, and it has never been fully resolved. The Sherman versus Firefly story is one chapter in that debate, and it is a chapter that ends with a clear conclusion. When quality matters enough, when the enemy has weapons that your weapons cannot defeat, quantity alone is not sufficient. You need the right weapon, and sometimes the right weapon comes from a surprising place. This is a story about more than tanks. It is a story about institutional pride, about the difficulty of admitting that someone else has solved a problem you could not solve yourself, about the human cost of procurement failures, about the ways in which national narratives sometimes obscure inconvenient truths. The American tankers who went into battle in standard Shermans against German Panthers and Tigers deserved better than they got from their own procurement system. The British engineers who gave them the Firefly deserved more credit than they received. And the honest history of World War II deserves to acknowledge that America's best tank was not American. It was British. It was the Sherman Firefly. And that matters. So the next time someone tells you that American industrial power and American military equipment were simply the best in World War II, remember the Sherman Firefly. Remember the tankers who wished their Shermans had a better gun. Remember the German commanders who feared the Firefly above all other Allied armor. Remember the British engineers who solved the problem that American procurement could not solve in time. And remember that the best weapon is not always the one made by the most powerful nation. Sometimes the best weapon is the one made by the nation that learned its lessons fastest and acted on them most decisively. In this case, that nation was Britain. And that is the buried truth about America's best tank in World War II.